we want to move to the first issue here and our first guest, and we want to be talking about the just ridiculous media coverage in the U.S. media, the Western media, as it concerns Ukraine. Very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Ben Norton, who's a journalist and the editor of the new outlet and podcast, Multipolarista. You can find it at multipolarista.com. Ben, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure being here. One of my favorite outlets. I love Breakthrough.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, it's our pleasure to have you for sure. Ron, sorry, did I cut you off?
No, I was going to come in there and say, yeah, it's great to have you on, but I think you got it. It's our pleasure. You got it for both of us, Eugene.
Thank you.
The pleasure's all ours.
Well, Ben, the issue at hand is, well, there are many issues at hand, but we really wanted to have you here because the way the media has been covering the crisis in Eastern Europe, I think has been, in and of itself, almost like a weapon of war in the United States. And it's been, in some ways comical, in some ways tragicomic, if you will. So before we go to the first thing, I was hoping we could actually play this clip from NBC Nightly News of Richard Engel from Monday night, I believe it was. Wait, okay, we're pulling it up here now. But it's him. Many people probably saw this. It's the grandmother with an AK-47, and this grandmother is training to fight or whatever. She's got some interesting backers with her, but just sort of the way it's presented, I think speaks to so much to how the media is operating and how the media is working here. But I'll just ask you this, Ben, before we go to the clip. I mean, what in your view, what does this really say about the mainstream media in the United States that there can be such a one-sided presentation of everything that's happening there in Ukraine and near environs?
Well, it's further evidence of the fact that Western corporate media outlets simply reflect the interests of Western governments, and not only politically, but even when it comes to the actual so-called reporting, almost all of these stories are attributed to anonymous U.S. intelligence officials. So these are the great CIA spies who brought us hits like the WMD's fake news scandal, who brought us fake news like the claim that the Iraqi military was taking babies out of incubators in Kuwait, that Muammar Gaddafi was giving Viagra to soldiers, that Havana syndrome was this crazy, sci-fi dystopian attack by Russian and Chinese ray guns on U.S. diplomats and spies. Actually, it ended up being mass hysteria. The point is, all of these stories have something in common. They are fed through the media. They're laundered through the media by anonymous U.S. spies. And because they're anonymous, they never face any consequences. And because it advances U.S. foreign policy interests, they're never challenged, even though this past week we saw a classic example of this. Multiple media outlets, and not just in the U.S., in Britain as well, published these incredibly ridiculous stories claiming that on February 16th at 1 a.m., or some people said on February 16th at 3 a.m., Russia is going to launch this massive World War II-style invasion of Ukraine. Now, what was their so-called evidence for this? It was anonymous U.S. spies, U.S. intelligence agencies. Now, today is the 17th, and it didn't happen. Russia did not invade Ukraine, but it just shows that these stories can actually, not only will they spread fake news, they'll say that on this date, at this hour, Russia's going to invade. And then it comes, and the hour passes and nothing happens, and then they act as though, we're just journalists doing our job. That's not journalism.
No, it's not. I think that clip we were talking about, speaking of journalism, of Richard Engel from NBC News is ready to go. And this is, it speaks for itself. Let's watch the clip.
Some communities are taking matters into their own hands. Just across from Russia, in the city of Mariupol, some Ukrainians are preparing. Basic training for the whole family. Learning first aid to treat gunshot and shrapnel wounds. And weapons training. On a 7.62 caliber AK-47 is Valentina Konstantinovskaya. The 79-year-old is a retired accountant and a great-grandmother.
You're about my mother's age, and I can't picture my mother laying down on the concrete learning how to fire an assault rifle. Do you think you would actually be doing this?
Yes, if Putin comes, I should be able to shoot. The threat is very serious, she says, and I think every person in our country should be able to shoot from the window or on the street if the enemy comes.
I missed that
Ben,
baby.
why don't you tell us? Yeah, why don't you tell us what's wrong with that little package we just watched?
Well, when they say some Ukrainians are picking up arms, they specifically mean the Nazi Ukrainians, the Nazi ones. So that is an example of a training session organized by this group called the Azov Battalion. The Azov Battalion is explicitly white supremacist. They use white supremacist symbols. They are neo-Nazis. They are explicit fascists. That's not just an insult. They are actual Nazis who do Nazi-style salutes. You can see this in their video propaganda. And they believe that the conflict in Ukraine is a conflict between white people, they see Ukrainians as white, and Russians who are Asiatic and Mongoloid. They're supposedly descendants of, Genghis Khan and Asian Mongols. So they are explicit white supremacists, explicit Nazis, and they are a paramilitary group that was incorporated into the Ukrainian state after the 2014 US-backed coup, which is known as Maidan or Euromaidan. And they were a paramilitary group that was the kind of violent muscle behind the coup in February of 2014. And after the U.S. helped install this puppet government, in which the third in command right now of the State Department, who's a deputy secretary of state, she personally picked the people who would be the people who would lead the government. So her name is Victoria Nuland. So the point is that after this coup in which these fascists played a key role, they were directly incorporated into the Ukrainian state. And now we see that Western corporate media outlets are praising Ukrainian Nazis for training children and 79-year-olds. And I just want to add one other line here. I remember very vividly constant propaganda from supporters of apartheid Israel who will have these ridiculous propaganda photos and videos of young children holding guns or whatever in these photo ops. And then they say that Hamas and the Palestinian resistance are training little kids to shoot guns. I mean, meanwhile, MSNBC is praising Ukrainian Nazis with this video footage of little kids with assault rifles.
I mean, it really is. I mean, there's just so many elements to it, and just like even the impact it's making. I mean, or even the sort of the context of it, which is so rooted in the idea that there's an imminent invasion, which, as you pointed out very well, Ben, seems to not be that imminent, but it just builds into this idea of, well, something's coming, it's imminently coming, the Russians are coming. I saw some Fox News reporter do this whole long thread about how there's going to be like Russian paratroopers coming down on Kiev. I mean, and to me, it seems like it works so hand in glove with to create this broader sense among the American people of, the menace at the door that is Russia when you see these kind of images. And to me, to not have or to either ignore the basic fact checking around who these people were. They weren't even trying to hide it in terms of the different patches and things. It just shows that it feels so deliberate.
And
well, Eugene, we've seen this for many years now.
Well, I just wanted to add one thing onto that because I want to get your take on this. It's like, it's not just the whole saying, oh, there's going to be an invasion on this date at 2 a.m. And then once it doesn't happen, saying the next thing. It's also the way they're framing every little thing that happens when clearly it's obvious that Russia's not going to invade. Like, it's like, okay, now it's that Russia hasn't invaded because of the insane hawkish behavior of the U.S. And I actually want to show a tweet showing just that. It's a Julia Yaffe tweet. I don't know if she's still at the Atlantic, but she's definitely a hardcore Russiagator.
Puck News. Puck News, which I haven't been able to figure out what it is other than just like a laundering factory for CIA disinfo.
Can we put that up? Because I think it's really emblematic of what I'm talking about here. That tweet in particular, if we can. Maybe it's not worth it. Maybe this is a sign.
Well, yeah, I think this is the tweet you're referencing where she admitted that lying is part of the U.S. foreign policy strategy.
Yeah, this is it. This is it right here. She actually says, like, with all the alarm around the Russian invasion, it's important to keep in mind that the alarm itself and using the U.S. media to keep the alarm ringing is part of the Biden administration's strategy to keep pressure on the Kremlin. It is the strategy. And she's not saying that in a negative light. She's praising it. That is our American media class right there. Like, when it comes to the issue of war, everything that the US is doing, no matter how insane it is the right thing to do. And if what the US says is going to happen doesn't happen, it's because the US was playing some like 5-dimensional chess where they were showing Putin who's boss. And it was so obvious to me over the weekend when we saw like Russia like trying to de-escalate, saying that they're going to withdraw troops, and they started to withdraw some troops. And then immediately the Americans were like, well, see, that's because of what we've been doing. That's because of the pressure we've been putting on them. So it's like they're all working in tandem. I can't remember another time, except maybe with the war in Syria, but this might be worse, where the US media and all these journalists were just like acting as stenographers in the most like shameful way for the US State Department.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned the Julia Ioffe tweet. I was going to mention that because it really shows, one, this example of a reporter who just regurgitates claims from anonymous U.S. intelligence officials. I mean, basically all of her stories are fed to her by U.S. spy agencies. And two, it shows how willingly they just praise anything that the U.S. government does as this masterful strategy. And it shows how Washington's and also London's strategy is to have their cake and eat it too, and to say that, well, we manufactured this crisis and supposedly Russia's going to invade. It didn't invade, therefore it's proof that we helped avert this disaster that we created in the first place. And I think we should talk about why this is happening. You know, I mentioned that London is involved, and we've seen this very interesting division within Europe. And I think it shows these growing cracks within the NATO bloc between the US and Britain, the Anglo-American powers, if you will, and on the other side, Germany and France. We've seen that the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, was just in Moscow meeting with President Putin. And similarly, President Macron of France also just took a trip to Moscow. Germany and France are trying to reduce tensions. They don't want a war in Ukraine. And that is because they want to import cheap Russian energy. Of course, it's not out of benevolence. They want to import cheap Russian energy. This is all about the new Cold War. I think we really need to keep in mind what's happening here. And not just Russia, but also China. This is all about keeping Europe dependent on the United States, enforcing NATO bloc discipline, and preventing countries like Germany and France from having closer relations with both Russia and China. I mentioned, of course, importing gas and oil from Russia. In the case of Germany, President Biden made this very clear in the press conference he had with Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, in which Biden repeatedly said, I mean, he just emphasized it as hard as he could, we are going to cancel Nord Stream 2 if Russia invades. We are going to cancel Nord Stream 2. This is a massive pipeline being built between Russia and Germany, which would mean the end of Ukraine as a gas transit state, which means Ukraine would lose billions of dollars per year that it gets in fees for transiting gas from Russia to Western Europe. So this is about keeping Germany down, keeping Germany dependent on U.S. energy exports. The U.S. has actually, in the past few months, become the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, the LNG, in history. Larger than Russia, larger than Qatar. The U.S. is now the largest exporter of LNG. And that is because Europe has been importing more gas from the U.S. because it's not importing that gas from Russia. And we've seen that Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been repeatedly saying, we are preparing a massive sanctions package against Russia. So what is happening is the U.S. and also London, as its kind of junior partner in crime, they're trying to enforce this NATO bloc discipline on Western Europe, especially Germany and France, to prevent them from economically integrating with Russia and China.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just think it's so important, everything you're saying. And this is why this is never ending. It's like every time a deadline is met, they change the goalposts or they change the deadline. And I want to show one more tweet, which is actually a quote from a piece that the person who tweeted this is quoting from. It's from a Politico piece. And it's quoting a think tanker called Michael Kaufman, saying basically that the prospect of a Russian invasion in Ukraine on February 16th was always overhyped. The time frame to really keep an eye on is what happens shortly after February 20th. So it's like this is insane. This is completely insane. Every time there's some date they throw out, they've been saying this for a month now. It's been a month that there's an imminent invasion of Ukraine by Russia. It hasn't happened yet, but in order to keep it going, they just, these think tankers and then random, officials and, anonymous intelligence people will come up with new time frames, and everyone just regurgitates it. They just swallow it and regurgitate it and accept it. It's insane.
Well, that's how you get a cushy sinecure in mainstream corporate media as like an editor, or as how you become a senior fellow and not just a mere fellow at one of the countless hawkish think tanks in Washington, right? Is you push these lines. We also saw the deputy director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, which is NATO's de facto think tank, one of the most influential organizations in Washington. So one of the senior executives at the Atlantic Council, a very influential figure in helping to create U.S. government policy, she tweeted this past Friday before the weekend that this weekend Russia is going to invade. They're going to decapitate Ukrainian leadership. They're going to destroy the infrastructure. They're going to destroy the electrical grid. Of course, none of that happened, but they just keep pushing it down because it's all about keeping this momentum on and putting the pressure specifically on, ironically, on U.S. allies. And this is the point I want to stress here at the end, is that the U.S. is actually targeting its own so-called allies by trying to enforce this discipline on them to prevent them from being too soft on Russia and also, of course, China, who are now major allies. So we've seen that the Ukrainian government has repeatedly said, Russia's not going to invade. We have evidence that Russia's not going to invade. There's no proof it's going to invade. Our intelligence shows us the opposite. It's not making plans. We've seen this from President Zelensky and also from the defense minister of Ukraine. And President Zelensky, I mean, there's a lot to criticize about this guy. He was elected on this platform, and he won in a landslide victory, claiming that he wanted peace with Russia. And as soon as he came in, the U.S. enforced that discipline on him, forced him to take these hardline positions against Russia, to shut down pro-Russian media outlets, to imprison pro-Russian politicians in Ukraine, and all of these horrific authoritarian measures. But even Zelensky is not pro-war enough for the U.S. We've heard these stories of President Zelensky being yelled at by Joe Biden on the phone. And I can only imagine these phone calls with this barely coherent man just yelling about corn pop and Putin invading. But the point is that the U.S. is actually targeting Ukraine, its so-called ally, targeting Germany, a so-called ally and major member of NATO and the leader of the EU, and they're targeting France. So we see that just as in the first Cold War, the U.S. bullied its so-called allies in Western Europe, in the new Cold War, it's all about bullying Western Europe to make sure that they never become too pro-Russian or too pro-Chinese.
Very well taken points all around. Ben Norton, editor of Multipolarista, multipolarista.com. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me. Keep up the amazing work. I always love your streams.
Hey, thank you.